Welcome back to Tabletop Titans and another Titan Tactics. There are many attributes that make for a top table player, but we're going to be taking a look at 5 techniques that top players employ to win tournaments. Of course, if you do enjoy this content, do consider liking and subscribing. It really helps us grow the channel, and also let us know that you guys want to see more of what we're doing. Warhammer is nothing if not a game about movement. This is how games are won and lost, and ultimately the combat phase is just another opportunity to do so. Our first technique has to do with combat movement. There's a number of ways to get extra movement during the combat phase. Let's first of all talk about basing. There's this concept in competitive play of basing your opponent's models. When you go to pile in or consolidate, you have to move closer to the closest enemy model than you started. This means that if you are base to base, you physically cannot move any closer than you already are. This means you can't pile in, you can't consolidate with that model. So when you base your opponents, make sure that you do declare which models are basing which and be clear about it. You can use this, of course, to your advantage by actually paying to interrupt solely for the purposes of basing your opponent. Remember, killing your enemy's models is just icing on the cake. You win by having the most points. So when your opponent is looking to pile into an objective, it actually might be worth to spend the 2 command points to interrupt and base a number of their models, blocking them off from getting further onto an objective or screening your further units out. So definitely something to be considering. Vice versa, of course, this is a great way for you to gain additional movement. When you pile in or consolidate, you have to move 3 inches closer to the closest enemy model. This is interesting though because they're 2 separate activations. So the first time you activate, you might move 3 inches closer to this model and move over. But now when you consolidate, you might have a new model that's 3 inches closer. Now you move closer to that one. So in certain ways, you can get up to 6 inches of extra movement, getting onto an objective, screening out, preparing for the following turn, and it's essential that you master how to actually do this. Our second technique for winning at top tables is to pre-measure everything. Always know the threat ranges for your and your opponent's models. So first off, know the melee threat range. Know how far they can move, how far they can charge, do they have advance and charge, and keep that all in mind as you're planning and plotting your own movements. Of course, by contrast, you also need to know about their shooting capabilities. And while this seems obvious, don't forget that they can literally move before they shoot. I can't tell you the number of times that people plan out all these different shooting and firing lanes and forget about angle because of extra movement. Consider, are they going to advance this unit? Is it worth getting -1 to hit to get line of sight into a unit you really didn't want to get shot at? So consider what they're going to be doing and look at it from their perspective. What is the meanest, worst thing that they can possibly do to you in the game at that exact moment? And consider how you can stop that. In a similar vein, always consider the worst case scenario. Many people will ask for an average charge, an average advance, and things like that, and that's helpful to a point, but it is just that, an average. So always consider the maximum distance that your opponent can move or shoot, and then decide how cheeky you want to get from there. How much reward are you going to get for risking getting closer to them, and find that balance. This leads me to the 4th and final point for pre-measuring, which is always check with your opponent. Ask them their ranges, know the possibilities, pre-measure and determine before you start moving, before you roll dice. This is going to avoid arguments, make for smoother games, and just have a better experience for everyone. The 3rd technique top players use at top tables is line of sight. Of course, there are many ways to hide in the game, but the question is, how do you get what you need to get done while still not getting shot back? Well, first of all, you want to stay on objectives out of line of sight. It can be tempting, of course, to get the armor save and getting into a piece of cover, but more often than not getting shot at all is better than getting shot with a +1 armor save. So consider when you're placing your objectives, or your terrain, or your units, how can you just barely tap within range of an objective while still being out of line of sight? And it's often worth having less bodies or being slightly out of position in order to do so. Additionally, when you are exposing your units, do so with the minimal possible amount that you need. If you're going to be shooting down a firing lane, just expose a tiny bit of them to be able to shoot around that corner. This is going to make it much harder for your opponent to shoot back at them. It's going to dictate where they can move their units and where they have to if they want to engage with you. And finally, of course, learn to avoid Overwatch. Overwatch can be absolutely devastating for some armies, and you want to, when possible, avoid it by charging out of line of sight. So charge through walls or ruins or breachable terrain so that your opponent cannot see you. It can even be worth giving it movement in order to actually avoid this Overwatch completely. Case by case scenario, but keep in mind, it might not always be necessary to take the shortest charge possible when you think you're going to lose a bunch of models to Overwatch. The 4th technique that top players use at top tables is trading. 9th edition is all about trading cheap units for more expensive units and giving up a smaller number of victory points for more victory points. How can you use them to destroy or even move block a more expensive units? This leads me to my 2nd point. While you want cheap and effective units, When you're actually playing the game, don't think of it that way. Think about how can you trade your victory points for your opponents. If you're putting a unit out there, are you going to stop them from scoring 4 primary points, but then give them 5 points in exchange with their secondaries? Then it's something not such a worthwhile trade. So be thinking about how do you trade those victory points rather than how do you trade those unit costs. Very, very important skill to learn. And lastly, of course, how can you kill 2 birds with 1 stone? Do you have a unit that can screen out your backfield while also performing actions such as retrieve battlefield data? Or if you're throwing a unit in the backline for behind enemy lines, can they also screen out or maybe move block some of your opponent's key units? The more value you can get out of a single activation in a single unit, the better you're going to be in the game. The 5th and final technique for playing at a top table is communication. This is a pretty imprecise game, and it's a very social game, so it's really important that you behave appropriately at these top tables and communicate with your opponent. First of all, create an understanding. Discuss how you intend to play the game, how you are using certain pieces of terrain, and just get rid of any ambiguity that you can. You really don't want to get halfway through the game and realize that you have a fundamentally different assumption on how something works. With that, you're going to try to avoid gotchas. While it might be tempting at first and you might see a short-term game, ultimately, it's going to bite you in the butt. We've seen this happen in the past with tournament play. And ultimately, one thing I'm thankful for is more and more top tables are on stream play, so it helps keep everyone honest and really want to be good and nice people. So this is a culture that is ever evolving and, in my opinion, ever improving. So really try to avoid those. It doesn't make for good gameplay. It doesn't make you look like a good player either. But also playing for intent is going to do some other things. If you have a 9-inch charge, place it as accurately as you can within a realistic amount of time. Make sure that your opponent agrees and go ahead and roll the dice. Don't get caught up in the minutia that don't really matter. And again, make sure your opponent is on the same page. This is gonna, again, avoid unnecessary arguments, and it's gonna keep the game moving. You don't wanna get to turn 3 and realize that you lost because you just couldn't get to turn 5. So it's important that you use intent to play the game as quickly and as honorably as possible, while also not weaponizing intent. So at the end of the day, these are the 5 techniques you can use to play at a top table. Use combat movement to your advantage. Make sure you pre-measure and measure everything. Be pessimistic about your estimations. Use line of sight to be able to engage your opponent while still staying safe. Make sure to make favorable trades in your advantage. And of course, 5, communication is key. Communicate with your opponent to keep games speedy, timely, and honorable. Those are the 5 techniques we think are essential to playing at a top table. If you guys have thoughts, let us know in the comments below. And of course, if you have any additional tips, we are definitely curious to hear. That's going to be it for me, everybody. I'll catch y'all next time on the tabletop. Bye!